You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. When World War I called troops to action and Europe couldn't send its usual waves of immigrants, the bustling industrial cities across the American Northeast and Midwest found themselves in a big labor crunch. To fill this gap, companies looked southward, sparking a significant movement of workers heading north. By the year 1919, it's estimated that about 500,000 African Americans had left the southern United States. They were part of the first wave of what's known as the Great Migration, which kept going until 1940. These African American workers stepped into roles in growing industries like the railroads, and also took over many jobs that used to be held by white workers. In some places, they even joined the workforce as strikebreakers, particularly during the labor strikes in 1917. Unfortunately, this led to increasing tensions, with a lot of the working-class whites, including immigrants and their children, feeling resentment towards the African American community. In the summer of 1917, East St. Louis, Illinois, and Houston, Texas experienced violent racial riots against African Americans, sparked by tensions over labor issues. After World War I ended, there was a quick reduction in military forces without a clear plan for reintegrating veterans into civilian jobs. This situation, coupled with the end of wartime price controls, led to unemployment and rising prices, making it even tougher for jobs to be secured, especially by African Americans in the South, where racism and segregation were rampant. The period after the 1917 Russian Revolution, known as the First Red Scare from 1919 to 1920, saw a surge in anti-Bolshevik sentiment in the U.S., building on the anti-German feelings that had developed during the war. Many in politics, government, the press, and the public became deeply concerned about the possibility of an attempt to overthrow the U.S. government to establish a Soviet-like regime. This period was marked by significant apprehension towards African Americans' demands for racial equality, workers' rights, and the right to defend oneself against mobs. President Woodrow Wilson, in March 1919, privately expressed his concern that African American veterans could be a channel for spreading Bolshevism in America. Meanwhile, opinions among white Americans varied significantly, with some predicting unrest while others saw no signs of impending trouble. At the start of 1919, Dr. George Edmund Haynes, serving as the Director of Negro Economics at the U.S. Department of Labor, highlighted the complex issue of reintegrating black soldiers into civilian life as a critical challenge facing the nation. A black veteran, in a letter to the Chicago Daily News, emphasized the transformative experience of service, stating that although black veterans had become new and worldly men, they needed guidance to fully understand and utilize their newfound perspectives. Webb Du Bois, a leading figure at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and its magazine editor, passionately argued that after the war, it was imperative to use all available resources to fight against the injustices present within the country, labeling inaction as cowardly. In the fall of 1919, after a summer filled with violence, George Edmund Haynes gave a report that set the stage for an investigation by the Senate Judiciary Committee. He highlighted that there were 38 racial riots across the country, where white groups attacked black communities. Notably, these incidents marked some of the first times black individuals collectively stood their ground and fought back against these attacks. Civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph, who led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, openly supported the right of black people to defend themselves. Furthermore, Haynes documented that from the start of the year until mid-September 1919, white mobs lynched at least 43 African Americans, 16 by hanging, the rest by shooting, and 8 were burned alive. State authorities, unfortunately, showed little interest in intervening or prosecuting these acts of mob violence. In the wake of these early racial conflicts in May, Webb Du Bois penned Returning Soldiers, an essay expressing disillusionment but also a defiant hope. He wrote of veterans returning from the war, shedding their military uniforms for civilian clothes, ready to confront America's racial injustices head-on, calling out the country for its failures yet returning to fight for what they believed in. On April 13th, in the rural parts of Georgia, the Jenkins County riot unfolded, causing 6 fatalities and leading to several properties being torched. This included the Carswell Grove Baptist Church and 3 lodges belonging to black Masons in the town of Millen. Moving to May 10th in Charleston, a riot broke out injuring 5 white and 18 black men. tragically ending in the deaths of 3 black individuals, Isaac Doctor, William Brown, and James Talbot. After these events, Charleston, South Carolina saw the imposition of martial law. A naval investigation later revealed that this riot was sparked by 4 U.S. sailors and 1 civilian, all of whom were white. In early July, Longview, Texas, experienced a devastating white race riot, resulting in the deaths of at least 4 individuals. This riot also led to significant damage to the African American residential area in the town. On July 3rd in Bisbee, Arizona, an unfortunate incident occurred when local police attacked members of the 10th U.S. Cavalry. This unit, predominantly African American and famously known as the Buffalo Soldiers, was established back in 1866. Lastly, on July 14th, a riot erupted in Garfield Park, Indianapolis. This incident was notably violent, with gunfire injuring multiple people, including a young girl who was only 7 years old. Starting on July 19th in Washington, D.C., the city witnessed an intense 4-day period of unrest and violence directed at African American individuals and their businesses. This upheaval was largely executed by white civilians and military personnel, who were wearing their service uniforms, spurred on by false rumors of a black man being arrested for the alleged rape of a white woman. These white mobs took to the streets, indiscriminately attacking black individuals, sometimes yanking others from streetcars to assault them. As these events unfolded, the local police force did not intervene to stop the violence, prompting the African American community to defend itself. In an attempt to reduce public gatherings, city officials shut down bars and theaters. At the same time, the city's 4 major newspapers, all managed by white owners and including the Washington Post, stirred up public frenzy further with sensationalist reporting and headlines. They even called for volunteers to join a so-called cleanup operation. After 4 days of chaos and with the police still not taking any action, President Woodrow Wilson called in the National Guard to restore order. When the dust settled, the toll was grim: 15 dead, of whom 10 were white, including 2 police officers, and 5 were black. Additionally, 50 individuals suffered serious injuries, with another 100 sustaining minor ones. This incident stands out historically because it is one of the rare occurrences in the 20th century where the white casualties exceeded those of African Americans in incidents of racial violence. The NAACP addressed this horrifying situation by sending a direct telegram to President Woodrow Johnson, condemning in no uncertain terms the participation of military personnel in these riots and the overall impact these events would have on racial tensions nationwide. They urged the president, as the nation's leader and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, to publicly denounce the mob violence and to enforce military law as required by the circumstances. Meanwhile, on July 21st, a separate but related incident occurred in Norfolk, Virginia. A white mob violently disrupted a celebration for African American veterans returning from World War I, resulting in at least 6 people being shot. To quell the disturbances, local authorities had to call in Marines and Navy personnel. Starting on July 27th, the city of Chicago witnessed its most significant and deadly race riot during what's known as Red Summer. The incident that sparked the violence involved Eugene Williams, a young black man who accidentally crossed into a beach area on the south side that was unofficially reserved for white people while swimming in Lake Michigan. Tragically, he was attacked with stones and drowned. Despite the clear assault, local police refused to take any action against those responsible. This inaction led to an eruption of violence that continued for nearly 2 weeks, predominantly involving young black men and white mobs, the latter often led by members of the ethnic Irish community. The conflict led to widespread destruction, especially in primarily black neighborhoods on the south side, where white mobs demolished hundreds of homes and businesses. To quell the chaos, the state of Illinois deployed a militia force made up of 7 regiments, totaling several thousand men. The toll of this brutal period was steep. 38 people lost their lives, 23 black individuals and 15 white. Over 500 were injured and around 1,000 black families found themselves without a home. While these are the official figures, other sources suggest the death toll might have been as high as 50, with some rumors claiming even more lives were lost. Observers like labor activist William Z. Foster didn't shy away from calling the violence what it was: an anti-Negro pogrom. Foster drew parallels between the horrific events in Chicago and the pogroms targeting Jewish communities in the former Russian Empire, driven by anti-communist sentiments. On August 12th, during their yearly gathering, the Northeastern Federation of Colored Women's Clubs strongly condemned the violence and destruction of black people's homes. They reached out to President Wilson with a plea to use every means within your power to stop the rioting in Chicago and the propaganda used to incite such. Later in the month, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People made another appeal to the White House. This time they highlighted an attack on their secretary in Austin, Texas, that had happened just a week earlier. Their message to the president was clear and pointed. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People respectfully inquires how long the federal government under your administration intends to tolerate anarchy in the United States. The Knoxville riot in Tennessee erupted on the nights of August 30th and 31st. The turmoil began after a black man was arrested, suspected of killing a white woman. A lynch mob, intent on finding the suspect, stormed the county jail. They set free 16 white prisoners, some of whom were accused murderers. The violence escalated as the mob then targeted the African American business district. In the fierce clashes that ensued with the district's black business owners, at least 7 people lost their lives and more than 20 were injured. In Omaha, Nebraska, during the last days of September 1919, a violent episode unfolded that has come to be known as the Omaha Race Riot. Here's what happened. A huge crowd, numbering over 10,000 and primarily made up of ethnic whites from South Omaha, descended on the county courthouse. Their goal was to force the authorities to hand over a black man accused of raping a white woman. This man, Will Brown, was tragically lynched by the mob. They hanged him and then burned his body, but the violence did not stop there. The mob expanded its rampage, targeting black neighborhoods and businesses on the north side, causing destruction that amounted to over $1 million. In response to the chaos and desperation, help was sought from higher up. The mayor and the governor made urgent appeals, and their calls were answered by the federal government. Soldiers from nearby U.S. Army forts were dispatched to restore order. These troops were under the leadership of Major General Leonard Wood, a noteworthy figure who was not only a friend of former President Theodore Roosevelt, but also a prominent contender for the Republican presidential nomination in the upcoming 1920 election. These efforts eventually quelled the violence, marking a dark chapter in Omaha's history. Let's take a moment to discuss a tragic event in American history that took place on the 30th of September in Elaine, Phillips County, Arkansas. Unlike many racially motivated acts of violence of its time, which often happened in urban settings, this massacre occurred in the rural South. It all started when the local black sharecroppers organized to advocate for better working conditions, a move that was not well received by the white minority, who feared the rise of socialism. These tensions came to a head during a meeting of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, when a confrontation led to the shooting of one white man, causing his death and wounding another. In response, planters and other whites from the area formed a militia. Hundreds rallied to their cause, essentially becoming a mob that, over 2 days, targeted black individuals indiscriminately, killing an estimated 100 to 237 black people, while 5 whites also lost their lives in the ensuing violence. In the aftermath, Arkansas Governor Charles Hillman Brow appointed a committee, made up of 7 prominent white businessmen, to investigate the incident. Their conclusion was to label the Sharecroppers Union as a socialist plot aimed at inciting violence against whites, a sentiment echoed in the media at the time, including a headline in the Dallas Morning News that claimed the sharecroppers had confessed to a plot of widespread violence against whites. Yet despite a thorough investigation by agents from the Bureau of Investigation, which involved interviews and document reviews, no evidence was found to support the idea of a conspiracy among the sharecroppers to commit murder. Still, the local judicial system moved quickly to try 79 black individuals, all of whom were convicted by all-white juries. 12 were sentenced to death and the others to various terms of imprisonment. It's important to note that by this time, most black people in Arkansas and other southern states were disenfranchised, meaning they couldn't vote, run for office, or serve on juries. However, there was a silver lining when the U.S. Supreme Court intervened, reversing the convictions of 6 defendants due to the lack of due process, a decision that paved the way for greater federal oversight in state criminal cases to ensure the rights of defendants were protected. Following this, another racially charged event known as the Wilmington Race Riot occurred on the 13th of November, involving violent confrontations between white and black residents in Wilmington, Delaware. This underlines a period of intense racial strife in the United States, underscoring the challenges of achieving justice and equality. In 1919, a tragic series of events unfolded in the United States marked by racial violence and injustice. In Ellisville, Mississippi, a white woman, Ruth Meeks, accused a black man named John Hartfield of attacking and raping her on June 9th. Following the accusation, mobs relentlessly pursued Hartfield. On June 24th, as Hartfield tried to escape by boarding a train, he was shot, captured by a mob, and taken to jail. The sheriff later permitted the mob to take him. They first had a doctor treat his gunshot wound, ensuring he would survive long enough for them to execute him in a premeditated manner. 2 days later, on June 26th, Hartfield was taken to a field, where the mob brutally mutilated him, hung him from a tree, and shot him more than 2,000 times. After falling from the tree, his body was burned. Around 10,000 people gathered to witness this gruesome act, and vendors even sold souvenirs and photographs of the event. Reports claimed Hartfield's last words warned others to think before acting wrongly, a statement that appears highly improbable considering his severe injuries and desperate attempts to escape. Later that year, racial tensions escalated elsewhere. On September 8th, in a separate incident, a mob lynched Bowman Cook and John Marine, 2 black men, in retaliation for a shooting. Misidentified by police as responsible for the death of a man after black taxi drivers in Jacksonville, Florida, started refusing service to white customers due to several drivers being killed by white passengers. They were abducted from jail 3 weeks after the incident. The mob shot them, tied Cook's body to a car, and dragged it for miles, turning their deaths into a public spectacle. Tensions also rose in the labor sector. On October 4, 1919, Gary, Indiana became a battleground for racial and labor strife during a union strike at the U.S. Steel Mill. The predominantly white labor force went on strike, but black workers did not join, leading U.S. Steel to hire nearly 1,000 black strikebreakers to keep the mill operational. The company offered these strikebreakers protection, accommodation, and extra pay, further inflaming tensions. In an attempt to provoke the white strikers, U.S. Steel orchestrated a parade of black residents towards the mill. The sight of black strikebreakers led to a violent confrontation when a mob of striking workers attacked and brutally beat 40 of them, leading to the intervention of the state militia and federal troops. The chaos of what became known as the Riot of 1919 eventually contributed to breaking the strength of the unions in Gary. These events from 1919 highlight a year marked by racial violence, labor conflict, and profound injustice, reflecting the turbulent and divisive period in American history. In September of 1919, during a period known as the Red Summer, the African Blood Brotherhood was established in the northern cities of the United States. Their purpose was to act as a movement of armed resistance. For several weeks afterward, there were continuous protests and appeals to the federal government. One notable appeal came in a letter dated November 25th from the National Equal Rights League. It called on President Wilson, asking the United States to protect its racial minority in the way Wilson had insisted Poland and Austria protect theirs, saying, "We appeal to you to have your country undertake for its racial minority that which you forced Poland and Austria to undertake for their racial minorities." Dr. George Edmund Haynes, in his report of October 1919, which was highlighted in the New York Times among other leading papers, made a clear call to address the issue nationally. Haynes highlighted the alarming number of lynchings in the United States, pointing out that from the years 1889 to 1918, over 3,000 people were lynched, with the majority being black men and women. He criticized the states for their failure to act, emphasizing that their inaction often resulted in no prosecution for the murderers. Haynes's argument was that lynchings were not just a regional problem, but a national crisis, stating, "It is idle to suppose that murder can be confined to one section of the country or to one race." He connected this violence directly to the racial riots directed at black communities throughout 1919. Haynes warned of the dangers of allowing such violence to go unpunished. He argued that it encouraged lawlessness among whites prone to mob action and fostered bitterness within black communities. This atmosphere, he said, could turn a minor incident into a riot, leading to an ever-escalating cycle of violence and, potentially, a race war in many U.S. cities. He also pointed out that such unchecked violence poisoned public discourse, making it impossible to have a rational discussion about race issues or any topic that different races or regions disagreed on. In 1919, the New York State Legislature established a special committee known as the Lusk Committee, tasked with investigating anyone within New York State who was suspected of engaging in activities against the government. The man leading this committee was Clayton R. Lusk, a newcomer to the state Senate from Cortland County with a business background and conservative views. Lusk had strong opinions about those he considered threats, labeling them as alien enemies. Interestingly, out of the comprehensive 4-volume report that the committee produced, only about 10% was their actual findings. The rest was filled with documents obtained during raids or provided by witnesses, a lot of which focused on activities in Europe or how different states were trying to counter radical movements through things like citizenship programs and educational initiatives aimed at promoting patriotism. The committee also targeted the more radical elements within the Socialist Party and the industrial workers of the world. Upon reviewing the seized materials, the committee particularly highlighted efforts to mobilize African American communities and the encouragement of revolutions featured in foreign-language magazines. During a particularly intense period of racial violence against black communities in Chicago, a federal official spoke to the New York Times, attributing the unrest to influence from the industrial workers of the world, Bolshevism, and other extreme radical movements. He supported this statement by sharing copies of black publications that encouraged partnerships with leftist groups, praised the Soviet government, and unfavorably compared traditional black leaders' schoolboy rhetoric to the courage of the jailed socialist Eugene V. Debs. The Times described these publications as malicious and well-funded, highlighting the involvement of radical socialist factions under the dramatic headline, "Reds Try to Stir Negroes to Revolt." Later in 1919, Oklahoma's Daily Ardmorite reported on the discovery of a black society supposedly responsible for inciting riots. In the face of these accusations, some black leaders like Bishop Charles Henry Phillips of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in Nashville, Tennessee, urged the black community to reject violence and instead adopt patience and moral persuasion. Phillips dismissed claims that black people were influenced by Bolshevik propaganda to participate in riots, arguing that it wasn't in their nature to betray or revolt against the government. He pointed to the long-standing issue of mob law and injustice as reasons for black discontent. This narrative of black individuals being influenced by Bolshevism continued, with the Wall Street Journal in August 1919 simplifying the cause of race riots to a Bolshevik, a Negro, and a gun. The National Security League echoed this interpretation. When the New York Times covered the Haynes Report in early October, which documented violence and governmental inaction, it framed it as evidence of a new Negro problem, driven by forces aiming to incite animosity and division between races. Previously, black leaders appreciated the sacrifices made by whites, especially during the Civil War, which had provided black people with opportunities unseen in other parts of the world. However, according to the Times, this gratitude was being overshadowed by more militant black leaders who were divided into two camps, one spreading revolutionary, Bolshevik propaganda, and another aggressively challenging all forms of racial discrimination, advocating for uncompromised protest to secure citizenship rights and full democratic privileges. The Times pointed to William Edward Burghardt Du Bois as an example of militancy and Bolshevism, highlighting his stance on self-defense against lynching, as stated in his editorial for the Crisis magazine. "Today we raise the terrible weapon of self-defense. When the armed lynchers gather, we too must gather armed." While endorsing a call by Haynes for a biracial conference aimed at ensuring better protection, justice, and opportunity for black Americans, the Times also supported engaging in discussion with black leaders who were not in favor of militant tactics. In mid-October, the Times reported on government findings showing efforts to spread Bolshevik propaganda among America's black communities. This phenomenon was seen as part of a wider issue, mirroring the kind of agitation happening in the North and West industrial centers, which had large populations of foreign workers. The newspaper identified publications and groups focused on Negro betterment as channels for spreading the teachings of Bolshevik leaders Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, highlighting their appeal by contrasting the racial tensions in the United States with the racial and ethnic harmony claimed to exist in Soviet Russia. Furthermore, the Times highlighted a push for the unionization of cotton workers among Black Americans, framing it as a challenge to the Southern white capitalist establishment, with quotes encouraging Black workers to assert their rights and leverage their labor power. The narrative around the rioting in Elaine, Arkansas, evolved in the Times from initial reports of unrest to more detailed accounts, attributing the violence to propaganda aimed at Black communities, supposedly by white individuals promoting social equality and encouraging an uprising. Initial reports mentioned rumors and stories brought back by white posse members, leading to the arrest of a white man alleged to have been inciting social equality among Black people. The situation was framed within the context of fear over a larger plot for an uprising against whites, with early headlines mentioning trouble traced to socialist agitators, and later dispatches labeling captured individuals as captive Negro insurrectionists. During a period of racial unrest in Chicago that targeted communities of color, officials from the Department of Justice inaccurately informed the press that groups like the Industrial Workers of the World, Socialists, and Bolsheviks were disseminating propaganda to incite racial hatred. Reports from Federal Bureau of Investigation agents suggested that the Black community was increasingly embracing leftist ideologies. One report highlighted the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's push for African Americans to demand equality with whites and to use force if necessary. Early in his career, John Edgar Hoover analyzed the riots for the Attorney General, attributing the violence in Washington, D.C. in July to attacks by Black individuals on white women, and the Arkansas events in October to agitation within a Black lodge. He also pointed to radical propaganda as a general cause, and accused socialists of supplying material to Black magazines like The Messenger, which then stirred its readers. Hoover, however, failed to mention the role of white aggressors documented by local officials. As head of the Department of Justice's Radical Division, Hoover initiated an investigation into Negro activities, and specifically targeted Marcus Garvey, believing his newspaper promoted Bolshevism. He even authorized the hiring of Black undercover agents to infiltrate Black organizations and publications in Harlem. On November 17th, Attorney General Alexander Mitchell Palmer briefed Congress on the perceived threats from anarchists and Bolsheviks, dedicating over half of his report to radicalism within the Black community and their leaders' open defiance in reaction to racial violence and riots that summer. The report criticized Black leadership for poorly responding to race-related riots, and highlighted a collective sense of pride among African Americans for having fought back, insisting they would no longer passively endure violence and intimidation. Palmer's report reflected concern over a growing spirit of defiance and desire for vengeance among Black leaders. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.